Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome back to the dinner table. I hope everybody brought in the New Year safe. Or if you brought it in at home with your family and friends like I did, I hope y'all enjoyed yourself. Or if you went to church and you brought in your New Year, getting your New Year's blessing, that's what I'm going to do next year. But to kick off 2025, y'all already know I have another fire case for y'all. But I think I want to give y'all a serial killer case next week, and it requires a lot of research, so I'm going to give y'all a little short and sweet case this week. Hope you don't mind. But listen, cousins, if you ever start to feel like you and your significant other are just falling out of love with one another, nothing is working, all y'all ever do is bicker and fight, and your relationship is just slipping away, murder should never be the answer.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
Okay, cousins, this week at the dinner table, I'm going to be telling y'all about the murder of 22-year-old Norman Raymel McCaster. So, in order to bring this case full circle, I have to tell y'all about Norman's wife first. Juatasha McCaster was originally born Juatasha Denton in 1990 in Chicago, and she grew up with an ex-military dad who was a dedicated and motivated soldier. And she was really quiet growing up, but she was really good in school. She was the honor roll type of girl. And she had a beautiful singing voice. She was actually in the church choir, and she was a little church girl. But like I said, she was really good in school. She was smart, hardworking, but by the time she got to high school, she wasn't a quiet girl no more. She started speaking up a little bit more, showing interest in boys, and, letting her personality shine through. And that's when she met Norman McCaster. Now, as a child, Norman grew up in Arkansas, but when he was 12, he moved to Chicago with his grandma on his dad's side. And I don't know if he was at that age where his dad was like, okay, it's my turn to take over and be a parent. And he moved to Chicago. I don't know what the reason was, but at this time, he and his dad started to rekindle their relationship. But he was a good kid. He was a great athlete. And his sport of choice was wrestling. And he was a really good wrestler. And not to mention, he was really handsome, so he was somewhat of a little player with the girls at school. But all throughout high school, he and Watasha were on and off. This is still a high school relationship. We like each other, but we're still young. This is high school. Now, their relationship didn't last long after high school because Norman ended up moving away to go to college on a wrestling scholarship. But his dreams of wrestling and going to school did not last long at all. Because literally his freshman year, when he had gotten there, he was at a frat party one night. He got into a small little college fight. The cops got called. And he ended up getting in trouble for underage drinking, and he lost his scholarship. And once he lost his scholarship, he couldn't pay for school anymore. So he had to move back home with his family, and that's when he decided he was going to join the National Guard to help him pay for college. And at the time, this was the best decision for him because by joining the National Guard, he was still able to be a civilian and go to school and then be a soldier and get the benefits as well. Hey, if there's one thing about the military, it can definitely be used as a stepping stone in the right direction to get your career and your life on track. Now, when Norman moved back home, this is when he and Watasha started to spark things back up. They reconnected and they got their relationship back up and going. But she was going to school up in Springfield at the University of Illinois, taking her prereqs for med school because she wanted to be a dentist. And not only that, but she eventually wanted to follow in her dad's footsteps and join the military. So since she was going to school all the way up in Springfield, of course she was away majority of the time. So she would really only get to see Norman when she was on breaks from school. And then he eventually went away for basic training. So she was pretty much holding him down while he was away. So, about a year after dating, Norman decides that he wants to take their relationship to the next level. He young, but he ready. He's like, this is the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. I see my future with her. Let's just go ahead and get married. So, as soon as he graduated from basic training, all of his family, his friends came up to support him, and he went ahead and took this opportunity to propose to the woman of his dreams. Now, the wedding was nothing extravagant. They tied the knot at the courthouse on October 26, 2010, After the wedding and after Norman finished all of his military training, they moved to Springfield so that Tasha can be closer to school. She joined a church choir, and Norman became a volunteer wrestling coach at a local high school. He was working temp jobs, and all at the same time, he was still pursuing his education. So would you look at this? They were a lovely little young couple. Young, newly married, ambitious, educated, just they have goals, okay? I like this. But being all the way in Springfield, which was about a 3-hour drive away from where they grew up, Norman and his dad's relationship started to become a little distant. They went from talking damn near every day to a few times a week to just a few times a month. And it even got to a point to where a month would go by and they still hadn't even spoken. So at this point, his dad started to get a little bit worried, but not quite worried enough to make that 3-hour drive down to Springfield. It's now 2012, 2 years after Norman and Tasha got married. It's October 29th, 2 days before Halloween. A deer hunter is driving down the road in Mechanicsburg, Illinois. And from where he was driving, he could see something at the bottom of the creek, but he couldn't make out exactly what it was. And at the time, he didn't think too much of it, so he just goes ahead and drives on home. But when he makes it home, he just has this really unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. So he hits up one of his friends and he asks him if he can go back to the creek to check it out with him. But when they went down the embankment, they realized that they were looking at the body of a headless man. He had no head, no hands, and no legs. And they hurried up and called 911 expeditiously. And when the police arrive, it's just devastating at what they're looking at. But they hurry up and start looking for clues at the scene. So right off the bat, they see blood on the guardrails of the highway, and then they see drag marks leading down to the embankment where the body was found. And around the torso, they find an extension cord, which I'm thinking was most likely used to help drag the body down. But off first glance, you can clearly tell that this is a black man. And the detectives are thinking a black man murdered in Chicago. They're thinking this was probably drug or gang related. And due to the size of the torso, they're thinking that more than one person is involved. So they're finding a lot of good clues at the crime scene. As they continue examining the scene, they also find a bunch of napkins, which was probably used to try to clean up the scene. But the thing they find that was deemed to be the most helpful in this case was a Walmart receipt. And it had blood on it. And one of the items on the Walmart receipt was a reciprocating saw. And whoever committed this crime clearly wasn't paying attention. Just sloppy. You literally left a Walmart receipt behind. Basically, it's the smoking gun in this situation, especially if you paid with a credit card. On top of that, this receipt is going to tell them everything they need to know. It's going to be time stamped. They're going to be able to go to Walmart and go to that exact time and see who made that purchase. And that's exactly what they do. So when detectives get to Walmart, they get to the security footage and they go to the exact timestamp that's on the receipt. And on the surveillance footage, you can see a black woman purchasing the items. And it doesn't look like any big hardcore criminal or any gang member. But she was the person purchasing the items on October 25th at 11:54 p.m. Same time on the receipt. With a credit card belonging to, drumroll please, a Juatasha Denton. Now, the body was found 4 days later on October 29th. So, 2 days later on October 31st, an autopsy was performed on what body they did have. And at the time, because the hands and the feet and the head were removed, they still didn't know who this body belonged to. So, for the time being, he was John Doe. But the coroner did make note that the body was dismembered post-mortem. Although the autopsy couldn't tell the exact cause of death, because just by looking at the torso, there were no marks, no cuts, no stabs, nothing. So they believe the injuries definitely had to happen to the head. A toxicology test was also performed, and there were no drugs or no alcohol in his system. Now, being that the investigators really didn't have anything to question this girl that they seen in the surveillance on just yet, because technically all they had was the receipt, and that's really just circumstantial evidence because anybody could have thrown this receipt out. But it did have a reciprocating saw on it, which was most likely the tool used to dismember this body. And she was on camera buying the saw, so what else are we left to believe? Not only that, but there was blood on the receipt too. I don't know, this is just seeming a little bit too suspicious to not go ahead and question her. But they decide they don't want to talk to her just yet. So instead of questioning Juatasha, they go ahead and start surveilling her. And I mean, they were following her every move. And she just really didn't seem like this cold-blooded killer. I mean, she was still going on with her normal life. She was going to class, she was still going to church, running errands. She was just living her normal 22-year-old homebody, didn't party, didn't drink, just doing regular shit. But they're like, man, we have to find something. Like, she guilty of some. So one night while they're watching her house, they see her take out the trash. And we all know once you put your trash on the curb, it becomes public property. So her trash is pretty much free game to them right now. And they're like, let's see what she been throwing out. Now, at first, they weren't finding anything in her trash. However, after pulling surveillance and going through Juatasha's trash for about 2 weeks, detectives finally find some evidence they can work with. And in her trash, they find shredded up credit cards, a shredded up driver's license, a shredded up military CAC, and military uniforms, all belonging to a Norman McCaster. So after finding all of Norman's belongings in the trash, they realize that he's in the National Guard. So they decide to pull up to his National Guard station to see if anyone has seen or heard from him. But his unit lets detectives know that he didn't show up to his October battle assembly that was the weekend of October 25th. And they also said this wasn't like Norman because he was described as a soldier. So he wasn't going to miss mandatory training, especially when that was some extra income coming in. Yeah, he needed that. Now, detectives also get in contact with Norman's temp job. And his job lets him know that he didn't show up to work on October 29th either, which is the day his body was found. Now, at the time, detectives still didn't know if the body they found was that of Norman McCaster. But they did know that when you join the military, you have to give a blood sample in order to know your blood type and all that good stuff. So they used this opportunity to ask the National Guard if they can provide Norman's DNA sample to them. And this does in fact confirm that the John Doe is that of Norman McCaster. So when detectives finally notify his family and they're questioned by police, the family tells investigators that his wife Juatasha told them that Norman had just picked up and left with some local drug dealers. And then she started telling people that he was heavy into drugs. And at this time, they still haven't talked to Juatasha, but they went ahead and put a tracker on her car. And then after doing a little bit more digging into Juatasha, they find out that she filed for divorce on November 7th. Mind you, y'all, his body was found on October 29th. So she tells everybody that her husband just up and disappeared. He stopped showing her work. He left with some local drug dealers. And a week later, she's filing for divorce. But at this point, they're still watching her trash. And we might as well just start calling her the receipt queen because they find more receipts with a lot of cleaning supplies on them. They also find out that she put in an order for a deep freezer from Lowe's. However, she did end up canceling the order for the deep freezer later on that same day. And this just so happened to be the day that she went to Walmart and purchased the saw. So she put in an order for a deep freezer, then canceled it, then went to Walmart and bought a saw instead. Detectives figured she was most likely gonna try to store the body in the freezer until she figured out what to do next. But then she figured out a different plan and went and got the saw and then canceled the deep freezer. But after 3 weeks of going through her trash, they start to find something even more interesting. They start finding large quantities of Visine. And I do mean large quantities because when you go to buy Visine, you typically only buy 1 or 2. You're not buying no 10, 15, none of that. And this is when they decide to take a second look at Norman's toxology report. And this is when they find out that Norman has above normal levels of tetrahydrozoline in his liver. And this is the main component of Visine. And if consumed in large amounts, can be deadly. Also in the trash, they find a bathroom tile and bloody gloves. So at this point, they've seen enough. And on November 26th, right before Thanksgiving, they decided, hey, what better time than before the holidays to question Juatasha? And in their minds, they decided to question her before Thanksgiving because It's Thanksgiving. She's probably going to go back home to be with her family, and she may not come back. So this is the perfect way and the perfect time to catch her off guard. And with everything they've been digging up in her trash, they pretty much have enough to convict her. So she agrees to come in. Now, initially when she comes in, they don't tell her anything. All they tell her is that the National Guard was concerned. They thought her husband may be missing because he hadn't reported to duty, and they just wanted to do a little wellness check on him. So she agrees to go down to the police station and answer a couple of their questions. So when she gets down to the police station, she starts telling them about how Norman was changing, how he started drinking a lot, how he was on drugs, how he started making these new friends. And just 2 days before their anniversary, which remember was on October 26th, she came home from school and he was in the living room watching porn. And she's a good church girl, and she wasn't going for that in her home. So they got in a huge fight, and he pushed her up against the wall. And this was the first time he had ever put his hands on her or been aggressive. So she was just so shocked and so scared. She told him to pack his stuff and get out. She goes on to tell the investigators that he took everything. He took all of his belongings and he just left. So investigators are just sitting back, letting her tell her little story, lying her ass off. So they're like, he took everything? He took all of his belongings? And she's like, yes, he took everything. And this is how they know she's lying, because they found all of his clothing, his uniforms, his IDs, credit cards, all of that shredded up in her trash. So once they start throwing this information out there that they know she threw his stuff away, she gets shook. She stopped talking, and she eventually asked for a lawyer. But this was after they had already placed her in handcuffs, and it really set in that she was under arrest. So after this, they let her know that they found Norman's body, and they found everything she threw away in the trash. So she was officially arrested and charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, dismemberment of a body, and concealing a corpse. And she sat there with no emotion. She just kept asking, so I'm under arrest? Girl, yes. So her case went to trial on March 26, 2014. By now, she was 24. And during the trial, the prosecution painted the perfect picture of Norman for the jury. He was the world's greatest man. He was a soldier. He was a volunteer wrestling coach, a college student who was hardworking and had his whole life ahead of him. So what was her motive? Why did she have to kill him? The prosecution said that Juatasha was a perfectionist, and she was losing control of her marriage. For the first time in her life, she was failing at something, and she just couldn't take it. So after she was arrested, of course, they did a full search of her home, and they dug up a little bit more evidence that could help put the nails in her coffin. They found this girl's personal journals with her deepest, darkest secrets. And in these journals, she was complaining about how bad of a husband Norman was, and just going on and on about how unhappy she was. And along with the search of her home, they also find a calendar. And on the month of October, more specifically the day of October 26th, that day is completely blacked out on the calendar. And we know now that the 26th of October is Juatasha and Norman's anniversary. But Norman would never see their 2-year anniversary because he went missing on the 25th. But the defense chimes in and says something stupid like, this is not reason to kill somebody. She was the one that filed for divorce. She was going to leave him because he was on drugs and all that stuff, and she was sick of it. So she decided to kick him out on the 24th, and she was ending their marriage. But the prosecution called in one of Norman's squad leaders, and he lets the jury know that in the National Guard, when you report to duty every month, you're required to take random drug tests. And Norman passed every single last one of them, so they know it's not true that he was on drugs. On top of that, there was no drugs in his system when they found his body. In fact, the only toxin they found in his body was that of the tetrahydrolazine, which, like I mentioned, is the main component in Visine, which was found in Juatasha's trash in an unusually large quantity as well. But they said that in her mind, the Visine wasn't working fast enough, so she decided to go with Plan B. Now, along with the search of her home, they also search her computer. And in her browser history, they find some very incriminating search history. This girl was searching how to kill your husband and get away with it, how to kill your husband with Visine, and even searching for hitmen. Like, girl, what are you doing? And believe it or not, she started doing these searches way back in June. But she didn't kill him until October, so she had been plotting for a long time now. Now, the prosecution also brought forward a star witness. And this star witness was a former classmate of Juatasha. So he tells the jury that Juatasha had asked him for a gun because she was supposedly going to go shooting with her dad. So she asked for the gun. He gave it to her on October 24th. She gave it back to him on October 25th, the very next day. Talking about she didn't need it anymore. But when he checked his gun, he seen 2 bullets were missing. So here's what the prosecution is thinking. You have this young 22-year-old woman still trying to find herself, maybe feeling stuck, confused in this marriage, and she doesn't know what to do next. She's losing control. Her marriage is failing, and she's never failed at anything in her life. So she comes up with this plan to plot against her husband and kill him. So the most discreet way to do it would be to poison him. So she decides to use Visine. But that wasn't working fast enough. And I don't know how she was doing it. I don't know if she was putting it in his water and maybe he wasn't drinking it or what. But it clearly wasn't working. So she decides to go with plan B and borrow one of her classmates' guns. She gets home from school and she finds Norman in the living room watching porn. So she decides to pick an argument with him. And in the heat of the argument, she shoots him twice in the head. She then dismembers his body with a saw, getting rid of his head because that's where the evidence was, and then his hands and his feet so that he can't be ID'd. She then disposes of the torso, and she just got away with the perfect murder. So she thought. And y'all listen to this. They actually call Juatasha's mom to the stand as well. And she says that Juatasha gifted her father a saw. She gave her dad the same saw that she killed her husband with, y'all. She cut her man's head off, dismembered him, cleaned it off, boxed it up, and gave it to her dad. Here you go, Dad. But the defense argues back and says that the receipt was put at the crime scene to frame her for murder. And it's like, be for real. This girl don't do nothing but go to school, go to church, and go home. Who could have framed her? Was it the church first lady or was it one of the deacons? And on top of that, they argue that she didn't even bother to report her husband missing because she supposedly claimed he just ran off. And that's why she decided to just dispose of all of his belongings. But nobody believed that. So after both sides rested, the jury deliberated for 7 long hours. And after 7 long hours, they found Juatasha guilty. Duh, we all knew she did it. But being that she was found guilty of all charges, she still had to await sentencing. And being that she was being charged with first-degree murder, that was holding a 20 to 60-year prison sentence. Dismembering a body, 30 years. Concealing a homicide, 2 to 5 years. So basically, she was facing a good life sentence. But in the end, she was sentenced to 55 years for first-degree murder, 20 years for the dismemberment, and 3 years for the concealment. So 78 years total. And she'll be eligible for parole in 2079. And believe it or not, to this day, Juatasha still has never admitted to killing Norman. And his head, his hands, and his legs still have never been recovered either. But y'all, if you're going to commit a murder, remember, if you decide to clean up the crime scene and throw away your trash and then put it out on the curb, it then becomes public property. And it can and will be used against you in a court of law. But y'all, that's the end of this week's case. I hope y'all enjoyed this very short and sweet one. And as usual, I'll see y'all back here, same place, same time next week.